Buenas noches. I'm going to start right away. This is a combined work of myself and Dennis Stanford. And it's really important to understand the term that we're using is hypothesis. This is not, okay, I'm not used to this. This is a hypothesis, which means that there's some evidence, but there's many things to test as well. Okay, so we'll get right on it here. Whoops, wrong one. There. Okay, so we probably all know what the current, generally the current idea is of how people came to the Americas. This is in all the textbooks. You see it in most museums. This is the standard operating theory or hypothesis. And it's simply that people came at the end of the last glacial maximum. They came through Siberia, through what's called Beringia, where as the sea levels were quite low, the land masses between Eastern Asia and North America were connected. They sometimes call it a land bridge, which is an interesting concept because it's 1,500 miles wide. So it's not a bridge, but anyhow, it's a connection. And then the idea is that people came through. As the glaciers retreated, a corridor opened up and people came into North America and settled all of the Americas within a very short time, within a few hundred years. And the idea is that they were Clovis people when they arrived. Okay, so they were what we call Clovis. I'm going to explain that here in a minute. And about 14,000 years ago. And we've all been taught this. This is the answer to all of it. Well, we don't think the evidence supports this, and this is what I'm going to be talking about this evening, and giving you some of the evidence that we're working with. Okay, if people came before Clovis, there must be sites in Siberia or Beringia, which is this big area here, Beringia, during the glacial maximum or just at the end of the glacial maximum, but that shows you all the sites that we know of from that time period. 0. Okay? If people came through here, we haven't found evidence of them before about 14,000 years ago. That was a problem. Dennis Stanford worked in this area for 25, 30 years looking for the antecedents of Clovis because we all knew they had to be there. So he came to this idea from working in this area. I came to this idea from a completely different place. If you look at the technology and the tools of Northeastern Asia at this time period and all the way into fairly recent time periods, it's based virtually entirely on microblade technology. Microblades and insets into making points and knives, and many of their tools were these microblades. Very, very distinct technology that looks nothing like Clovis. In fact, it's about as far away from Clovis as you can be and still be flaking stone. Okay? So this was a problem for us. This is the kind of thing, this is an item that was found up in Beringia. This is the kind of thing they were making. Okay? So we're looking, I can only cover generalities tonight. We're looking at great details like Carlos was talking about last night and when we do the analysis of these things. So what is Clovis? The culture that everybody has focused on is this thing we call Clovis. And it has several major technologies. It has large blade technology, and there's actually 2 different technologies here. Very distinctive technologies. It has large, thin bifaces. Most of the tools are made on flakes, but also some on blades. We have a fairly limited but rich assortment of bone, ivory, and antler tools that are very distinctive. And we also have things like engraved stones. Okay? What Clovis is best known for, of course, is not all those other things. It's the projectile points. And these are called Clovis projectile points. They have a variety of shapes depending on where they're found. These are Eastern and these are more Western styles. But they share a completely same concept. They're a very complex biface thinning technology. Again, I cannot get into all the details tonight. I'll point out a few of them. So if we're finding an antecedent, somebody before Clovis, we would expect to see these technologies. Maybe a little different, but we would still have blades, we would still have thin bifaces. Okay? And everybody pretty much agrees on that's what we should find before Clovis that turns into Clovis. This is a schematic of the various concepts of the technology, starting with a piece of stone. And they had choices. They went this direction, or they went over here, or they came down here, etc. So we have the bifaces, the blades, etc. All the way down to the finished projectile points and all the little tools. So the Clovis technology is pretty well studied. It's not something that's unknown. We also have other aspects of behavior in Clovis, one of which is there's a preference for really exotic stone. The primary stone sources, they did use whatever was available, but they also went out of their way to get exotic stones. And they really liked red and white and crystals. We almost always find a Clovis point made of quartz crystal every place. Okay? This particular stone comes from up in the mountains in Wyoming. It's very high, and even in modern days, in the late Holocene, at some summers you can't get to this stone source. So at the end of the Pleistocene, it's amazing that, first of all, they found it, and then they ignored all the other good stone and went and got that to use. And then we find pieces made from this in many places in the western United States. So they really preferred these stones. Another thing that we see with the Clovis behavior are caches. Caches of large Clovis points. Some of you saw the casts today, where there was a big white one. Okay, that was found in this cache. This is part of the cache here in Washington State, in the very northwestern part of the United States. And this particular cache represents 80% of the Clovis points found in Washington State is in one cache. These are also these caches. They're slightly different in the way they're made up. They're also associated with a lot of red ochre. So they tend to be buried and encased in red ochre. There's probably now 15 of these caches that have been found, and there's no pattern to where they're found. They're just randomly scattered across the landscape and been found accidentally. We've never found one intentionally because we can't figure a pattern for them. We think many of these caches, there's quite a bit of a discussion about what they represent. Some of them are probably caches that were buried to be dug up and used. But many of them are probably buried as offerings, just to be left forever. Okay? So this is another behavior we see in Clovis. Whoops. And then we do have these bone tools. This shaft wrench, they're called. This is oftentimes used as a very distinctive Clovis thing. We only have one. Okay. Of course, many of our sites do not have any bone preservation. They're in the western United States, they're in the open. Most of these tools have come from caches. These are all from caches, or from the rivers in Florida where the sites were submerged, and that preserved them. But we have Ied Bone Needles. These long are called sagae or ivory points. These are made out of ivory, marfil. These bi-beveled ends are made out of usually antler. Some of them are clearly used as points. You can see the impact damage on the tip. But only one of these has been found in a kill site. The rest of them have been found in caches. Okay. Distribution of Clovis sites. This is not Clovis sites, this is Clovis points that are officially registered. This work's been done by David Anderson and a few other people. And this is a density graph. The density, the orange is the densest, as you can see here. So Clovis although we think of it as a western thing, it's not. It's an eastern thing. It's a southeastern thing, and up the river drainage is here. Here's the Mississippi, so most of it's east of the Mississippi. But you'll notice one spot here, this area, it's a peninsula, it's called the Delmarva Peninsula, and there are more Clovis points that have been found here than all of west of the Mississippi combined. Okay? So what we're saying is, although we have Clovis sites and distributions, this is where they're most dense. It's also where we see the most variation in style. Tends to be in these areas. So it seems to be longer lived here than in the West. Look at the dates. Our oldest date is down here in Florida. And then we have some other old dates right here. And they seem to get younger as you go out from here, although there's a fairly old date up here. But the youngest dates are out in the very far west, northwest. If people were coming from Asia down the corridor, you would expect the oldest dates to be here, right? So this was an enigma for us. There's a real interesting pocket here of density in northern Mexico and southern Arizona. But again, the dates are fairly young, okay? And then if you look up in the northeast, they're quite young up this way. And that's probably because the people that came, that turned into Clovis or developed into Clovis, it was still glaciated up here. Okay? So there's not much similarity between the archaeology of Clovis and Beringia. So if we're trying to find the antecedent, or where Clovis came from, with the bifaces and the big blades and stuff, where do we look? Well, it happens that a lot of my background was in Western Eurasia, Southwestern Europe, and so there was a lot of similarities that people had pointed out before and then said, oh, they're just accidentally similar. But when I started looking at it, I thought, wait a minute, there's just too many similarities. We need to study this. So this is where we see the most similarities. It's also at the right time. It's before Clovis. Okay? So we have what we call the Solutrean. This is why it's called the Solutrean hypothesis. We have the Solutrean, and I've worked in a number of these sites. I've published on Solutrean. I'm very familiar with the technology. It's distributed basically in what we call the Basque Refugium. So during the glacial maximum, there's the Upper Paleolithic people that were living in Europe were squeezed down into 5 small areas, okay, during the glacial maximum where they could live. And the Basque Refugium is the only place we see a Solutrean. We have an Italian Refugium, the Balkan Refugium, the Ukrainian Refugium, and they all still maintain an Upper Paleolithic style and technology from before. But Solutrean is completely different. Well, not 100% different, but it's very different. So, and it also seems to be related to rivers and coasts. Now, the other thing that you're not seeing here is that the coastline was way out here during the Solutrean times, and it's been estimated that 22,000 square kilometers of Solutrean territory are now underwater. That's a big area that we're not seeing. And that's important to keep in mind when I'm talking about what we think happened. We also see 5,000 years of Solutrean. That's a fairly long time. It's 3,000 BC from us. Okay? And during that time, we see changes in development in the Solutrean technologies. We also see differences in different areas. So the Solutrean technologies here are different, especially in the very late period as we get towards 17,000 BP. In the late period, the Spanish, or what we call the Vasco area, the Solutrean changes quite a bit from this. So there's a lot to choose from, but they all have blades and thin bifaces. Okay. So here's a set of Solutrean artifacts. And so the main things that we're seeing is the large blades. There's actually 3 different blade technologies in the Solutrean through time and space. But the main thing that holds them all together is the way the cores were made for these blades, all 3 different technologies, is completely different from the way they made cores before or after in the same places. It's a different technology. It's a different way of perceiving stone. Okay? And I can get into that detail with anybody who wants to, but we don't have time tonight. Okay? Take my word for it in this case. So we have 3 different blade technologies, one of which is bidirectional. You can see there's blades struck from this end and from this end to the middle. But it always has a flat back. Okay? We also have some interesting things that we do not see in Clovis. We've got these shouldered points, which are classically Solutrean, but usually very late in Solutrean in France. And then we have the big thin bifaces, and we also have these indented base points, mostly in the north coast of Spain, in the Basque country. We also have in Solutrean, these are Solutrean. I showed you pictures of the Clovis ones. These are basically identical. The bone artifacts and the antler artifacts are basically identical, including the Ied Bone Needles. And of course we have engraved stones, which we have throughout the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. So it's not specifically Solutrean, it's everybody did this. Okay? Interestingly, none of these things occur in Siberia or Beringia. None. Okay? Here's just more examples, some of the engraved stones. The other thing that Solutrean was really well known for is several things. They were very good innovators. As far as we know, they discovered or invented the Ied Bone Needle. They invented biface thinning. They invented the spear thrower. They invented the bow and arrow. They invented harpoons, as far as we know, archaeologically. So they had great innovation, but they also were really, really keen on their exotic raw materials, especially quartz crystal. So again, this is a trait we see as being shared. We also have caches of very, very large, oversized Solutrean laurel leaves. There's one that's very well known. There's 14 of these things. This one's almost 60 centimeters long. And they're paper thin, just amazing flaking. And it was covered in red ochre. So starting to sound kind of familiar. And then we have these indented base points that we see here. And this is important. We'll see why in a bit. And they're mostly associated with these sites right at where the Pyrenees meet the Bay of Biscay here. So anyhow, we've got the exotic stones and the caches. We also, Solutrean is part of the Upper Paleolithic cave art tradition. And within the Solutrean age sites, we also see occasionally, images, images of sea animals. These have to be walruses with spears stuck in them. And then we have seals, we have flatfish like plaice. These tend to be deep water fish. We also see other fish. There's another one there that's a deep water flatfish. We also see fish that look like salmon. And then we also have images of the northern Atlantic penguin called the great auk. I'm going to talk more about this in a bit. These are not common, they're uncommon, but we don't see them in other time periods. We see these primarily in the Solutrean. So this is giving us a hint that they're looking towards the water. This is really, really good archaeological work that was done by Lawrence Strauss. He worked with colleagues in Spain, worked in La Riera Cave, a very deep excavation. We put this chart together, but this was their data, which shows the different levels from the lowest Solutrean level to the upper Solutrean level. And if you look at these different animals, this is when they have their pups, their babies, on the shore. All of these Solutrean sites are in the mountains, away from the shore. Of course, the shore at that time is now underwater, so we can't look at that. But we find that it's very unlikely coincidental. We don't have Solutrean people in the mountains most of the time, although this very first level, it looks like this is based on animal bones in seasonality. It looks like we have them all year round, but that lowest level is only 1 meter square. Okay, as you went down, they got less and less. But so what we're suggesting is that where were the Solutrean people during these winter months and early spring months? Well, they were probably on the beach. Well, what's on the beach? All these seals, a great food resource. Now, we can't prove that because where we need to look is under the water. Maybe someday we'll be able to get there. So the next question then is, there's, at the end of Solutrean, 17,000 years ago approximately, and then Clovis, 13,500 years ago. That's like 3,500 years missing. So if we're going to have people becoming Clovis from Solutrean, we have to have something in between. And this is what we've been working on primarily, although our colleague Darren Lowry has done most of the work on this. Yes, and there are things older than Clovis now. Clovis is no longer first. The Clovis first paradigm is dead. There's still a few people that hold out, but now we have many, many, many dated sites, good sites. And where are they? And when are they? Where are they and when do they date? Interestingly, most of our pre-Clovis sites are in the eastern seaboard here. We do have a few other ones. We've got a Paisley Cave, but we have no associated artifacts. We have a human coprolite that dates to 14,300. And then we've got these sites in the mid-continent that are butchered mammoths, but without stone tools. Most of them don't have stone tools associated, which are older. And we've got the Gault site now, which is extremely well documented. I was a co-director of this project. And it goes from 16,000 to 13,700 below Clovis in stratigraphic context. And then we have sites like Valsequillo that may or may not be 25,000 years, very, very controversial. And Chicoite Cave, which is in northern Zacatecas, which is not published yet. There's an article being reviewed for Nature right now that and this site dates to 30,000 years ago. Some of it does. And interestingly, we got human genetic material at 30,000. That pretty much demonstrates people. And that will come out in due course. But notice, no ice-free corridor. We now know from studies that have been done that the ice-free corridor was not open soon enough even for Clovis, never mind these. So if you don't have an ice-free corridor, how do you get, in the glacial maximum times, how do you get people here? They either got to come out of Siberia along the ice here, or as we're saying, they come across the upper Atlantic along the ice. Either way, they've got to have ice, or they've got to deal with the ice, and they have to have boats, period. Unless they're coming from the south somehow, but that doesn't seem to be the case so far, although we've got, as you now know, we have some quite old sites in South America that are older than even what I'm talking about. And that will have to be explained by somebody else. It's going to take the heat off of us. Okay, so these are some of the sites I'm just going to briefly mention. So we've got these guys over here, Sinmar, which is actually under the water. It was dredged up. I'll talk about it and show you. Dating here, and then we've got Miles Point and Parsons Island. This is the really hot one right now. This is the one that's really coming along, and they're eroding out on the Delmarva Peninsula here, and we're getting whole series. This is just one of the dates. We're getting a whole series. We have about 25 dates now that all fall in this time range. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter over here in Pennsylvania, and Cactus Hill in Virginia down here. These are the best older than Clovis sites we have in North America, and they're all on the eastern seaboard. And of course, what we're not seeing is everything that's under the water on the continental shelf. Although the Sinmar, and you'll see some other things that came from there. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Cactus Hill has an incredibly long stratigraphic sequence. Whoops, wrong one again. I don't know why it wants to go there. That for the area, all the different styles are in stratigraphic sequence where they belong in time. It's perfect. It's just, you can't get a better situation. This style is always found at this time period, et cetera, all the way up almost to modern times. And you have a good Clovis level. And then we've got this underneath Clovis, pre-Clovis, this stuff. And for many years, this was discounted by the people that wanted Clovis to be first. But this is an exceedingly good site in stratigraphic context. There's been some really good work done on the geomorphology, et cetera. It's very well known, and you got your pre-Clovis here. And Clovis lies on top of that in an eroded context. So Clovis is put on a land surface, and then it eroded and dropped down on top of this. And we'll see that over and over and over again in these sites. We have Miles Point. Incredible work that's been done by Darren Lowry on the dating, the paleosols, et cetera, all the way up. He's named most of these. This is all loess. This is all wind-blown glacial deposit. Okay? And in this case, we had this projectile point sticking out of the bank right there in this paleosol. Other artifacts that came from this site in context in the paleosol, this little blade core, it's the only one like it, it's a curious one. We have bipolar technology here, and then we also have this little projectile point, bifacial projectile point. Now we get to Parsons Island. This is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that's eroding out, and the cultural level is this dark one here. So it's got 3.5 meters of sediment above it, all of which is loess. Most of the artifacts have been picked up after storms right on the beach right here. And so far, there's nothing younger on the island that we found. So we think everything that's been picked up on the beach is probably associated with this occupation. But we do have a number of artifacts that were still in place. This is eroding very quickly. We lose about 10 meters a year. You can't keep up with it. And this is the range of artifacts. We have many more artifacts now. So we have big bipointed bifaces. We've got these shouldered pieces. There's now 3 of these. We've got a unifacial point. In France, it's called point de face plan, plain face point. So it's unifacial, but the flaking goes all the way over the dorsal surface. And then we have these small rectangular points, not rectangular, triangular, sorry, some of which have indented bases that you don't see. And we have a really good blade technology, big blade technology there, plus a fair amount of bipolar work. Okay? So lots and lots of different artifact types here. Unfortunately, no organic preservation other than the soil. It's a very acidic environment. Whoops. Okay, this is another area of data, evidence that we've been looking at. I'm going to be talking about artifacts, again, fairly quickly, about some artifacts that have been dredged up off the bottom of the ocean by scallop fishermen. Okay? But this was a very fortuitous find. In 1970, approximately 1970, one of these boats, I think it's this one, the Sinmar, was out dredging in a new area for scallops. And what they would do is they drop their nets to the bottom. The nets are metal. They're not fiber nets, they're metal nets that catch the scallops, scrape them off the bottom. And it was a new area that hadn't been explored very much or used very much. And oftentimes what happens is they're dragging along and then they catch on something that stops the net. In fact, it'll stop the boat. and they call it a hang. They get hung up. And in this particular case, they were dragging along and they got a hang. And so they had to stop the boat, and they pulled the net up, and inside the net was a mastodon skull. Okay, a whole mastodon skull. And when they dropped the artifact or the things out of the net, they got the mastodon skull and something else I'm going to talk about. These are the known megafauna finds on the continental shelf. And this probably represents less than 5% of what's actually come from there. Because most of the time the fishermen don't report a hang, and they don't report the bones, because they're in competition with people and they don't want them to know where they are. Normally what happens when they get these bones up, they just throw them back over. In this particular case, this mastodon, which is here, it's right off of where the Susquehanna River drains and the James River coming out this way. This would have been the opening of the river mouth during glacial maximum times. Okay? So, and you can see where some of these other sites are that we're looking at here. This is what was kept. They got this mastodon skull, and as they dumped the mastodon skull out of the net, this stone knife fell out with it. Okay? They decided that there were two perfect tusks, and so they decided to cut the tusks up, and they shared them out amongst the crew, a piece of the ivory each. The captain kept this piece of tusk. One of the teeth, you can see it's a mastodon, not a mammoth, and he kept the knife. And then when he got back to shore, there was a little local museum. He gave it to the museum, and it was sitting in the museum since 1970, collecting dust on display. Darren Lowry happened to know the people on the island. He grew up there. He was a fisherman. That was his background. And one day he was looking through the museum, and he went up into the top, and he saw this in a case, and he said, "Wow, this is something we've got to do." So he got access to the tusk, and they did radiocarbon data on the tusk, and we did extremely intricate studies of this knife. We know the source of stone, which is up in southern Pennsylvania. So it's a local stone, relatively local stone. It's a rhyolite. It also has very specific chemical properties, so we can identify exact source. And it also erodes and weathers very specifically. And the weathering, this has been published, by the way. There's an article on this. The weathering indicates that it was lost or left or whatever. It was then covered by a saltwater marsh. It sat in this anaerobic environment for quite a while and got sulfidized. It was then exposed through erosion or some kind of exposure so that it oxidized. But what's really clear is that it was never tumbled down a river. It was never in a surf that eroded it. It's still sharp. And use wear analysis indicates it was used as a knife and then resharpened and used again on something soft like maybe mastodon meat, who knows. And there's hafting marks on it for use wear people. There's hafting marks on this where you can see where it was tied onto a handle. And there's also some damage from the net. Okay, so it all holds together very nicely. We cannot prove that this was associated with the mastodon. It was found with the mastodon, but we can't prove that it was used to cut up the mastodon. We need to go out, and we know where the location is. We relocated it. And there's another long story of why we haven't gone and explored it. It's at 240 feet. It's 80 meters down. It's just at the very limit of diving. So we have to have a very expensive remote vehicle, submersible, and the ship that we have to use, or a ship that we have to use, is $16,000 a day. So it's going to be quite expensive. We're working on a grant right now to see if we can't get that money. Bob Ballard's really interested in this, the one that did the Titanic. So maybe, who knows, maybe you'll see it on a documentary one of these days. And this is a Sinmar knife. I looked at it technologically. It's got lots of interesting features. It's a material that's very, very much like the vulcanite we were using today and during the workshop. It's got that fracturing quality of basalt. I think we can't demonstrate it, but I have the cast. You can look at it if you didn't look at it today. We think that's an overshot flake scar, but we'll wait and see. Well, we can't prove it because it's been retouched here, so it eliminates the plunging on the far side. Okay, so we've studied this in great detail, and we put it in. And Darren is a geoarchaeologist, and his real thing is reconstructing the geology, especially during the glacial maximum out there. And he looks at the eustatic rebound, the forebulge. When the glacier comes through and presses down, you get a bulge in front of it. And he's reconstructed all of that, okay, for the Sinmar location. This is all his work. This is his reconstruction of what the landscape looked like. We did isotope analysis on the mastodon, and it was eating C3 grasses. So it was clearly in a C3 grassland environment. So, and this is where, you can't see it, but this is where the Susquehanna River would have come out. You've got barrier islands. He's got it all sorted out. At least seems to be. These are the other bifaces that have been dredged up that have come from, we don't know what context, but they were dredged up off the bottom of the sea, off of Maine, Gulf of Maine. There's been several other ones that have come from St. Lawrence Seaway up there. Here's the Sinmar biface, and then these other ones. And although we can't date these directly, they fall into a class that's very distinctive. And we also don't have this type of biface and this type of technology in any later time period on the eastern seaboard. So these aren't younger things that just happen to fall into the ocean. Okay? Which is what some critics have said. Oh, you know, there's an archaic person out there in a canoe and they dropped their knife. It just happened to fall on a mastodon. This is an interesting piece. Again, Darren found this in the literature. It was excavated in 1970, and it was excavated by somebody that was digging a historic homestead from 1608. And it was found in the trench that was dug around the house. There were many artifacts, Native American artifacts of many different time periods all mixed together. But the tip of this was in mixed context. This base was found underneath the chimney in place, and they're from the same piece, and they were broken historically. And the person that found it, even though he was a historic archaeologist, recognized it as a Solutrean laurel leaf and said it was made out of French flint because he was familiar with French gun flints. Okay? Well, we've now done XRF, and this is clearly French flint. We can get real close to the valley. It's either the Clays Valley or the next one over where this flint came from. So the question is, how did it get there? Good question. You'll notice it's a very distinctive shape, and it's got a little bit of an indentation at the bottom. That's intentional. Okay? And this is a relatively common shape in Solutrean. Upper Solutrean especially. Okay, so anyhow, here we go. Yeah, I'm going to go back for just a second. I had the casts out today, and oh boy, and the casts, I have them with me if you want to look at them. The other thing is we have now several of these exact same form and technology that have been dredged up off the bottom of Chesapeake Bay, not too far from here, made out of local material. So if this one's a later piece that just happened to be dropped someplace by somebody, it doesn't explain why we have exactly the same form in local material. I think this is good. I think this came from France, and I think it came over during the glacial maximum. Can't prove it. I think it makes more sense than a British soldier picking it up as a souvenir in France, bringing it back to Britain, and then when he immigrated to the New World in 1600, happened to bring it with him and then dropped it when he was digging a trench of his house. That's a little far-fetched for me. It also happens that where the house is the first glacial maximum terrace of the James River. It's in the perfect context for being of this age. We'll never know. Hopefully someday we'll find one in good context. But we ought to be looking in northern Spain and southwestern France for things made out of American materials. Nobody's doing that. So you can reconstruct the different time periods as the sea transgressed and rose. It buried all these things, and so these are the different styles that you find, and you find them in exactly where they belong on the beach at the time period. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, this was done by James Adavasio back in the 70s. He was very soundly criticized for this work. Everybody agrees, whoa boy, I really skipped a bunch there, that his excavation technique was immaculate. Nobody criticized the excavation technique and the recovery. He was actually looking for baskets. He's a textile guy. And he was finding remnants of baskets in here, including down at the very bottom level where he found these things, and he got a 16,000-year-old date, carbon date. Absolutely in stratigraphic sequence where it belongs. People agree that this is all correctly dated all the way down to here, and then when you get to here, they say, oh, that's a bad date. It must be groundwater contaminating it to make it that old. The studies have now been done to indicate it never had groundwater in there. So it's not contaminated, the dates are good, and they were on basket fragments, so they were human artifacts that were dated, not just charcoal. So Meadowcroft is good, and this is where we started seeing the first of these points. But a little bladelet and just another retouched piece. Not a lot. The Galt site in Texas, again, this is one I was very involved with. It's basically known for its Clovis. The extent of the Clovis deposit is over 10 hectares. It's a huge Clovis deposit that's up to 1 meter deep of just Clovis. It's mind-boggling. We have 500,000 Clovis artifacts from our excavations. We estimate we've done 3% of the site. It's at a source of stone. We've got all the technology. A lot of the Clovis technology has been reconstructed from here because we have it all done in place. Okay. So the Galt site was, at the very top was a midden. In fact, it looked very much like the site you're going to go to, some of you are going to go to on Sunday. It's this big midden of dark material at the top with a lot of burned rock in it. It's called the burned rock midden. And we have all the way from late prehistoric down through archaic, late archaic, early archaic, middle archaic, late Paleo-Indian. In other words, it's like Cactus Hill. Everything is exactly where it belongs in stratigraphy. And then a really good Clovis level. And then we have, in this particular pit, we have a layer that's no artifacts in it at all, completely sterile. And underneath that, we've got artifacts, lots and lots and lots of artifacts. And we don't have good carbon dating on this site. Carbon wasn't preserved, but we have OSL dating, and the dating is consistent from the top to the bottom. These are some of the things we're getting from down there. The biface technology looks kind of like Clovis, but it's not full-blown Clovis. The blade technology down there is classic Clovis blade technology. And then we've got these funny little points. This one's typical of pre-Clovis, but these two are completely unique. Don't understand them at all. But we've got the whole range of tools and things. So this looks like it's developing into Clovis. And it dates from about 16,000 years ago to about 14,000 years ago. And that's down in central Texas. That's a long way from the East Coast, but it's a long way from Beringia. So these are the different sort of projectile point styles, and it's not just the styles, but the technologies that we're looking at. And it really looks, again, like the pre-Clovis is starting out here and expanding. And this points up here in Alaska, look at the date, 12/3. They're probably coming up the corridor, not down the corridor. Okay? And I've done a phylogeny of not just projectile points. These projectile points represent the technologies of these different times and places. And I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but we see the eastern stuff, the Solutrean stuff, which is older than the Beringian stuff, And then when you get out onto the high plains, it looks like they're coalescing. The technology is coming from the east, but the types or styles are coming from the west. Okay. So the hypothesis, the Solutrean hypothesis, this is where I need my notes because I got to get it right in English and I can't read the Spanish well. Okay, so the Solutrean hypothesis, what is it? It is that entry into eastern North America by a Solutrean people, a subset, not everybody Solutrean and not everything Solutrean, but a unit, probably the ones living on the beach, a Solutrean people from southwestern Europe, and we don't call it European because that implies us. It implies Europeans, which is Neolithic. That has nothing to do with this time period. Happened through exploration and hunting North Atlantic ice during the last glacial maximum. We think that the Solutrean people living on the shore were looking out on the ice and seeing what was out there and saying, man, that's a good food. All those seals, all those rocks. Why are we killing ourselves trying to go up into the glacial mountains and get a deer when we've got all this right on the beach? And when people start doing that, they start moving into those environments. I mean, why did Inuit people move into the Arctic? Okay, don't know. Because there was something to eat there. Okay, initially the people primarily remained in the coastal areas once they got to the other side. So they expanded their hunting territory is what we're saying. They didn't migrate. They didn't jump in boats and paddle to North America. They weren't on an exploration to find Indians. You know, they just expanded their hunting territory, got better at it during the glacial maximum annually because the sea ice moves up and down annually. And by the way, the great auk migrated back and forth annually across the front of the ice. All you got to do is follow the food. Okay. But when people did get into the Americas, they initially primarily remained in coastal areas and expanded southward coastally, eventually reaching eastern South America, which is part of a hypothesis. It's not the truth, it's a hypothesis, right? And then another branch split off from that eastern coast and went across the front of the glaciers and moved inland up the rivers in front of the glaciers and established themselves inland. Okay, and eventually some of those people went up the ice-free corridor when it opened into Alaska, and we know into Beringia. In fact, the genetics show that we have Native American people in the Kamchatka Peninsula. Interesting. Now, not then necessarily. Okay, and then as the Pleistocene ended and that North Atlantic ice annually retreated, it didn't come as far south anymore, it probably became untenable to continue that lifestyle, to continue exploiting that ice front. This is also the time when Europe started to open up again, so new landforms were available for people to spread back out into, and that's when we see the end of the Solutrean. And that's when we see the beginning of what I'm now calling the American Solutrean. It's not just pre-Clovis, it's the Solutrean in America. Okay? And then we've got the next one, right. As the sea level rose, early people in North America and eastern continent shelf began to explore and move inland, primarily up rivers. Okay. Okay, Clovis is a distinct technology developed along the eastern seaboard in the southeastern United States after people had already dispersed into the center. They were already out at Galt when Clovis developed. So what we're seeing is an older than Clovis occupation, at least of the eastern half of North America, before we see Clovis. Okay? And approximately the same time that all of this happened, about 14,000 years ago, people did come from Siberia. We're not suggesting that people didn't come from Siberia. This is pretty obvious. We have people coming out of Siberia. And the thing is, they kept coming. They're still coming. And of course, Europeans are coming now on airplanes and boats and stuff, but we had a founding population of people from the West Eurasian area, but they didn't keep reproducing more. I mean, they didn't get more immigration. It stopped. People came out of Asia and they kept coming and they're still coming. So we have these waves of people out of Asia that basically swamp what came out of southwestern Europe in time. Clovis expanded quickly, primarily around the Gulf of Mexico as far south as Venezuela. We have Clovis site right on the north coast of Venezuela. Classic Clovis technology. In the high plains of North America and in northeastern North America, possibly through diffusion rather than migration. So I don't talk about Clovis as a people. I talk as Clovis as a concept. And that concept seems to have been adopted by people that were there already, which were probably from the same ancestral stock. They probably came from the same ancestral base. But anyhow, I've got a whole article on that I was talking about with Andresa earlier. Okay, this is the hypothesis. So what we need to do is take the evidence that we have and then keep testing the hypothesis, keep testing all the pieces, and see where it goes. And this is just some of the things that are so similar, it's hard for me or us to grasp it was all coincident. We have the very, very specific biface production technology. Clovis, this is Clovis, not pre-Clovis. Remember, pre-Clovis are bipointed, but in Clovis we see the base being rounded and then they're doing fluting, which is definitely a North American invention. But the same overshot flaking, the same alternate, this side, this side, this side, this side, this side. We have the caches, we've got the exotic raw material. We've got two blade technologies that are identical with Solutrean, one that we don't have in North America that we have in Solutrean. So here's this comparison. Skip that. Keep in mind that when I'm showing these images, I'm showing these images, these are not just this piece compared to that piece. These represent the whole assemblage and all the technology that goes behind that assemblage, okay? We've been criticized by saying, oh, we're just cherry picking. You just found one that looks like that one, so therefore that's what you're showing. No, you can read our book and you can see the data. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces, okay? The same with the different styles of point de face plan that we see in Solutrean, and we don't see that in any other North American culture. It's like a limace or lesma, okay, I don't know what you call them here, those long skinny things that are unifacial. And then we have retouch flaking that's very distinctively Clovis and Solutrean, and we don't see that on the other Upper Paleolithic, and we don't see it in Siberia at all. We've got the indented base points. This is one of the Cactus Hill ones, but there's other ones, and this is the Northern Spanish one, Northern Spanish Solutrean. If you took points from North America and put them in a site in northern Spain, they wouldn't notice the difference. Okay. And then the two blade core technologies. This is one of them, conical cores. This is a Clovis blade one, and this is a Solutrean one here. There's other ones from different time periods. There's Magdalenian ones that look like this as well. And then the bone, ivory, and etc. tools, they're basically identical. And the engraved stones, okay. Yeah, lots of people had engraved stone. This is actually an engraved mammoth and a mastodon bone from Florida. And then we have this curious thing. At the Gauld site, it now turns out it's a pre-Clovis level, not a Clovis level. We have this, it's a clay sediment that's very low energy deposition. And then we have these stone cobbles that were put here, evidently by people. It's not natural, and it's a nice square, like platform. And the only other place in the world we were able to find this in Paleolithic time periods was in early Magdalenian, and it's exactly the same form. It's just virtually the same size, and it's got the same orientation. That could be coincidence by itself. Any one of these traits could be coincidence by itself. So what did I do? How do you look at these archaeological cultures looking at technologies? So what I did is I took technologies of all of these different cultures that you see here, Aurignacian, Gravettian, Magdalenian, early Solutrean, Ushki, which is one of the Beringian ones, Nenana Beringia, Denali Beringian, Mesa-Slusue Beringian, Ducti Siberian, and then the middle late Spanish pre-Clovis and Clovis, threw all that data into a big table and put it through cluster analysis. So I didn't order it in any way, it just all went in. And this is what kicked out. The cluster analysis showed, this is just showing similarities and differences, right? But look what clustered together. Middle Solutrean, late Solutrean, Spanish Solutrean, pre-Clovis, and Clovis. And then you've got all your Beringian ones that clustered together, plus early Solutrean, which to me should never have been named Solutrean because it only has one trait that's Solutrean. And then you've got your non-bifacial Upper Paleolithic, Western Eurasian groups here. And so they all cluster out with the branching happening way back here. So this is really different traditions from this. So your East Asian traditions are coming out of these traditions here. Okay, this was criticized because it's cluster analysis. It doesn't show relationships. And I was told that I had to do cladistic analysis. But the problem with cladistic analysis, it's used for looking at genetics. It assumes a genetic relationship. But I said, okay, let's use the same data and run it through cladistic analysis. So I did that, and I came out with this, virtually identical. The one difference, the really big difference here is we've got the French Gravettian, now we have I forgot where the early Solutrean ended up. Early French Solutrean, whoops. Now the early French Solutrean ended up where I thought it should be to begin with, clustered with the Gravettian and the Magdalenian. And here we go. This is all the Beringian, and this is pre-Clovis, Clovis, and Solutrean. These numbers indicate the trait that makes this distinction. So this helped because it told us why this branching occurred. Again, you apply this anywhere in the world and to look at how things might be related. So the 4,000 years, 3,500 years that people say we didn't have, here's your dates for Solutrean. These are outliers, are probably not Solutrean, we don't know for sure. Solutrean is very poorly dated, actually. Most of the excavations were done before World War I. Okay, that's when they dug up all these pretty artifacts, and the collectors got out there and dug all the cave sites out. We have no burials in Solutrean, by the way. There's not a single body, not a single skeleton from Solutrean with all that excavation. But we don't have a gap. Here's Solutrean. Here's our middle Atlantic early Paleo-American, which I'm calling American Solutrean. Then the southeast early Paleo-American date range. And here's Clovis. It completely overlaps with Solutrean. So there is no date gap. Okay? Okay, so this all makes a lot of sense. It seems to hold together pretty well. But what the heck would entice people to go out into that really nasty North Atlantic during the glacial maximum? Well, that's a perception, isn't it? Instead of asking this question, we like to turn it around and say, well, why wouldn't they do it? I mean, most of us and most of North American archaeologists come from the interior where we don't understand that water is a highway, not an impediment. Okay? Why wouldn't they? I mean, you see all your babies are dying from starvation. You've got seals right there. Come on. Why wouldn't they? So how did they? Well, there's a good reason why you might go out there. Every dark spot there is a seal. And that's now. It was actually richer then because of the upwelling of the nutrients and the nutrients coming off the glacial melt. So seals everywhere. You can hit them on the head. And the great auk is probably, to me, the most important. Sorry, I'm standing in front of you there. It's probably the most important resource. This was it's actually a penguin. Penguin, the word penguin is a Welsh word. It's not a South an Antarctic word. It's a Welsh word, which means white throat or white face. I'm not sure which. And these penguins are flightless birds. They stood about this high full grown, about 20, 25 kilograms of swimming nutrient. They're full of blubber and meat. As a matter of fact, and they went extinct in 1822 or 44, I forgot. There were millions of them historically. The Basque lived on great auks when they were whaling off of Canada in the early 15th century and afterwards. And there's accounts of the Basque collecting 5,000 auks in an afternoon just by getting in a boat and running them up a ramp and just hitting them on the head. And when you get to later time periods around the North Atlantic Rim, in archaeological sites, great auks are one of the most frequent bones you find. Okay? Why wouldn't you go for that? Come on. We also, historically, the great auks would migrate from off of Portugal to North Carolina and back annually. Just follow the food. Yeah, it's cold and probably gets pretty nasty sometimes on the North Atlantic, but that's our perception. There's been some really, really good reconstructions done by Richard Peltier on the North Atlantic ice during the glacial maximum. He has 3,500 years annual ice reconstructions. You can get online and see this as a animated video and see the ice going back and forth. This is an ideal route right from Europe straight over to North America on an annual basis. And there were parts that during the high summer and the fall, the sea ice would be not very good to follow. So this is winter and spring time when they're doing this probably, which is a good time to go out there because that's when the seals are having their pups. So one of the problems is the critics have said, you don't have any direct evidence of boats. How can you say they had boats? Show us the boats. Well, show me any boat from the Paleolithic. There's lots of places we're inferring that people had boats very early. People could not walk to Australia. There had to have some kind of watercraft to get across to Australia 50,000 years ago, at least. We have, what I haven't put on here is we've got some hominids like Floriensis, that couldn't have got to that island without some kind of watercraft thousands of years ago. We have Paleolithic people on Crete 300,000 years ago. Crete was never connected to the mainland. We have people off of Japan going and getting obsidian from islands that they had to go against the wind and the current to get to, or to get back from. They could get to it, they just couldn't get back, which indicates they probably had sails. Okay? All of these are accepted without question because the archaeology tells us that. But there's not a single piece of a boat. Not only that, if you look at the early archaeology for Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, there are no boats. We don't have any boat pieces. So why all of a sudden do we have to have boats for the North Atlantic? Where the people that are saying show us the boats are very happy to have them come from Asia across the ice in boats. But when you get to North Atlantic, there couldn't be, But the Solutrean were very innovative people. I'm absolutely positive they had boats. All right, if they came out of Siberia, they had to have boats as well, even if they went on land. I don't know if any of you have ever been up there, but in the summertime, you can't get anywhere without a boat. It's a muskeg, it's just water. Anyhow. And this is our idea of what their boats might have looked like, the kind of boats. They're hide-covered boats, skin boats. The Inuit umiaks, they might not have been exactly this, but they're very, very simple boats to make. And they were, when the Russians colonized Alaska, they were very wary of these umiaks because they were used for whaling. and they could carry large numbers of people and lots and lots of cargo, and they banned the use of umiaks in their colony because they were afraid that they were going to be attacked. Their boats were going to be taken over by these boats. That's the Russians. Okay? So if these are flimsy little boats, the Russians didn't know it. And there's some of these are in museums. There's lots of documentation. They were still used in relatively recent times. We don't know if they would have had sails or not. That may have been a later innovation or a later adjustment, but we don't know. The other thing about umiaks is they were designed to be used as shelters on land. So they were both a boat and a shelter, historically. Here's a lithograph or an engraving showing these umiaks being brought up on shore. You go across the front of the ice, things aren't very good, you just pull it out on the ice and turn it over and live underneath it until it gets better. This is what the Inuits did. Why wouldn't people earlier? This was an umiak that was an original umiak that was sitting up at Point Barrow, and the BBC wanted to do a documentary about our hypothesis, and they wanted to film some Inuit people using an umiak. So Dennis got hold of his old friends from up there and said, "You got one of those umiaks?" They said, "Yeah, we got the frame, but we don't have the skins to go on it. We'd love to do it again because we really miss the old umiak." And so the BBC they paid for them to prepare the walrus hides to put back on it. These are just tied on with rope. The frame is just tied together with rope or gut. I mean, it's not nailed, it's not planks, it's a very simple construction. So they got in there and they wanted to film them. Well, this particular day when they were filming them, you can see was May 25th, 2006. It was minus 36 degrees centigrade. Okay, we talk about environments as being harsh. Well, who are they harsh for? They're harsh for us because we're not used to it. The BBC cameraman got a frostbite. The camera froze, they couldn't use it. You know what these people thought about that day? That's what they thought about that day. They thought it was a beautiful day. The wind was blowing at about 30 knots, and there's no waves because you don't get waves on cold water. It's not the same as warm water. Okay, so is it harsh? Is it really that terrible? Not if you're an Inuit. You put one of these people down here, they wouldn't last a week. So we have our perceptions, and we can't help but pile our perceptions and biases on the past. Sometimes we've got to open our minds a little bit. Now, it doesn't prove anything. It just shows that in historic times, these people were well adapted to that. Their toolkits are no more complex than what we see in Clovis. We don't have a special boat building toolkit. And yet they were going out on the ocean and getting whales. It's not something I'd want to do. All right, so I'm going to go through this again. It's probably more than you want to know. So I'm going to try to, I'll probably show some slides that I'll skip through fairly quickly. But now that we have the human genome sorted out, and we're getting much better methods and technologies for sequencing the human genetics and other genetics, we can go back and look at the human genetics, mostly based on modern living populations. We don't have that many old samples, okay? So this is the mitochondrial DNA genetic tree, starting way back here, I don't know how many thousands of years ago, basically with one woman. These are the direct descendants of that one woman that ends up with all the mutations through time, ends up giving us this tree. The colors tell you where these genetic markers are, which haplogroups and haplotypes are, where they are. And you can see these are the blue ones are the East Asian. We got a lot of genetic mutations happened in East Asia. The red ones are Western Eurasia, or what we call Europe now. And then we've got these other ones, I can't even read it from here. Okay, and over here. So The Native American ones are the purple, and they occur here, and it's a haplogroup D. That clearly is derived from an Eastern Asian population. And we have a genetic clock as well for mitochondrial DNA, so we can say fairly accurately when these mutations occurred. Okay? Then we have, in Native American populations, we have C, again from an East Asian. We have B, again, East Asian. And we have A, again, East Asian. So geneticists say, everybody came from East Asia. The real kicker is, what do you do with that one right there? X2A. The X2A clearly comes from a Western Eurasian population. If you're going to say these guys all came from East Asia, that has to be Western Eurasia. Okay? X2A, the A indicates the mutation that happened in North America. Okay, so those people that have X2A, their antecedent females would have had X2, and then X2A, and we also have X2G in North America. When this was first identified, it was dated at 18,000 years old in North America. So the question is, can you get a Western Eurasia genetic marker all the way across East Asia, all the way into North America, leaving no trace? The geneticists that buy into the idea that everybody had to come from Asia, and there's quite a few that do because they've been talking to the archaeologists that believe that, say, well, there must be a ghost population. There were all these people out there that no longer are there and they didn't leave any genetic markers. Well, it would be the only one in the history of the world that didn't leave a marker. So we don't buy that. It's much, much easier to say they just came across the Atlantic. So here's the distribution of X genetics, X2, in worldwide distribution. So we've got this real pocket over here in the Caucasus where it seems to have originated. And then it's one of the more common, it's not common anytime, or any place, but when you get it, it's the west coast of of Europe, and it's the east coast northeast coast of North America. Okay? Your options are, you brought them all the way across Asia without leaving a marker, or you brought them across the Atlantic. We say the most parsimonious explanation is they came across the Atlantic. Now that's just with M2 DNA, or mtDNA, mitochondrial. What about the Y chromosome? Here's the Y chromosome, distribution of R, and you've got R1b, which is the dark here. It's on Western Eurasia, and R1b over here, and R1a over here, and one little pocket of R1b. And you notice again, nothing up here. This is the male lineal descent. And then you got this really nice pocket of R1b down here in Central Africa, which came evidently, this is the male one, right? If you look at the percentages, over here in northeastern North America, 60 to 100% of the males in these Native American populations have R1b. The geneticists are saying, oh, it's all modern admixture, post-Columbian admixture. Okay? That's what they're saying. And they do this when they look at their genetics. The first thing they do is they get all their data and they take all the European markers out because they have to be modern admixture. Then they do the analysis and say, oh, all the Native Americans came from Asia. Well, of course, if you take all the European stuff out, they're going to come from Asia. It's very frustrating. Working with Stephen Oppenheimer, I can't do this genetics stuff, but he wrote Out of Eden. He was Out of Africa author, etc. Very highly respected. This is his data. Anyhow, if this is all post-Columbian, and we know the historical record and how many people generally came from Europe over here and integrated with the Native Americans. You have Basque, you have French, you have English. How do you explain this being R1b so heavily invested in the Iberian Peninsula and so little in the Latin America. We know historically that were a lot more men coming from here to here than there were from here to here. Here you're talking about 100% replacement of males if it's post-Columbian. Can't be. That indicates to us that there's pre-Columbian Y chromosome. I know I'm blathering on here. Here we go. And there's these other studies. I was considering leaving these out, but I just want you to know that we've been looking at everything fairly carefully. And we've written an article and published an article that counters the geneticists that are saying everybody came from Asia. There's just so much information. We all, besides mitochondrial and Y chromosome, of course, we have the nuclear DNA, which is 3 billion base pairs. Mitochondrial, 16,000 base pairs. 3 billion base pairs that all get mixed up every time somebody has a new kid. Okay? So they're not lineal. They don't, the autosomal stuff isn't lineal like the mtDNA and the Y chromosome. So you can't talk about when it happened. Okay? And what happened. So we got all these mixtures. And I'll let you just read these. I've got it here, but most of you can probably read them better than I can. This is a really interesting one. The Cartiana are a group in the Amazon which are supposed to be the least admixed of all Native Americans. Historically, there's very little evidence that they were mixed with Europeans. And yet, when you look at their autosomal DNA, the French seem to be a descendant of a mix between Cartiana and Sardinians. Now, how could that happen? You can't see these Cartiana going over to Sardinia and having parties. So it could happen if, when they came to these conclusions, the geneticists couldn't figure it out. But that's because they didn't even consider the possibility that people came the other way. And it goes on and on. Lots of things. You notice these are all pretty recent. Well, we've been doing more with aDNA, ancient DNA. Of course, in North America now it's very difficult to do because Native American have the rights to the human remains, and most of them don't like the idea of any destructive analysis. But we do have some very interesting results on some aDNA. Some of you have probably heard of the Kennewick Man, who was 9,300 years old. That person had X2A 600 years ago, so it's not post-Columbian. Yeah, please feel free to jump out of here. I'm going on forever here. And there's more stuff, and et cetera, et cetera. So we contend that all of these things, if you look at them more objectively, that there is definitely Western Eurasian DNA in the Native Americans before Columbus. We've just run 40 new samples of Native American remains from northeastern Canada that date from 1,500 years ago back to about 7,000 years ago. And out of that 42 were X2A. Okay, so, I mean, it's definitely pre-Columbian. Okay. And that's in partnership with the Native American groups in northeastern Canada. The Algonquian-speaking groups are probably the descendants of the Solutreans. And the Basques like to think they are the original Solutreans, which in terms of language and DNA in the Pyrenees, they might be right. So the Basques may have a common ancestor with some Native Americans. So the paradigm, the Clovis-Peirce paradigm, we can evaluate it by looking at the expectations. Were there, anyhow, you can see what they are. And the answer to all of these, surprisingly, is, well, we're not sure about this one. The dates aren't strong enough to really tell us which direction. No, there's nothing Clovis in the ice-free corridor, and besides, the ice-free corridor wasn't even there during Clovis times. So the Clovis first Siberian origin for everything just doesn't work for this material to be Clovis. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't other non-Clovis people coming out of Siberia. So we're only looking at origins of Clovis. So then the question is, how do we evaluate the Solutrean in relation to the origins of Clovis? Well, you can make a guess here, can't you? All the greens, all the X's are in the yes column. And maybe you can come up with some other expectations, and we can put an X in one column or the other. All of this still needs testing. It's a hypothesis. And we will continue to test it, and we want other people to test it. Not just us, because they'll always say, oh, you're biased. You're only going to look at the evidence that proves your point. Well, we're not trying to prove it. By the way, in the press, please don't use the term that Bradley and Stanford believe that. I don't believe that. The evidence seems to indicate that. So here's the map that we draw now of possible migration routes or origin routes. I wouldn't call these migrations necessarily. Some of them were. So the standard went out of here, but not until after Clovis times, because there was no corridor. And possibly the coastal route, which makes a lot of sense, but the area in front of the ice here is longer than here. So if you're going to buy this one, you can't reject this one. Well, people do, never mind. And then we're talking about this one here, possibly up around this way, but more likely in front of the ice. And going down into South America, these guys went this way, this guys went this way, except now the evidence of these things, if you look at the dates, looks like they're going the other way. That's self-explanatory. And as of 2012, we published this in this book. I'm not trying to sell the book, but a lot more details in here. And do you have this in your library here? No? Right now, a Basque heritage organization is in the process of interpreting this into Spanish, French, and Basque. And hopefully in the next couple of years, it'll be available in those languages. But for this particular book, Roxana, where are you? Come up here. I just wanted to thank Roxana so much for all the work and all the people that worked with Roxana in putting together the napping workshop, and that's for you. And so you're welcome. Right. So if there aren't any questions, I'll be very disappointed. Or comments. Yeah.
Different questions. First, you see that there is information that we're not really, there is no evidence in East Siberia, but you have data. What do you think of that?
Of which?
Data, the site, the archaeological site in the Arctic. Data.
Oh, yeah. Is that the one with the two little infant skeletons? Oh.
I'm mentioning that they are in the Arctic by 47,000 years BC, which, they are not in distance. They are in the Arctic.
Oh, Yana, okay. It happens that I was working with Volodya when Yana was discovered. Yes, we do have it. It's 27,000 approximately. The assemblage is classic Gravettian. No biphases, nothing to do with antecedent in looking at the technology and all. And it's in the very western edge, it's at the mouth of the Yana River, the very western edge of what we call Beringia, but nothing east of there. That happened since I put the map together, but it still isn't, it's as far from the ice-free corridor as Venezuela is from the ice-free corridor. They're in the Arctic, and it's the first glacial, well, it's pre-glacial maximum. So they're definitely in the Arctic. But if you notice, it said no. It said glacial maximum sites. That's pre-glacial maximum.
Well, the other question is, I mean, you know we have the value of in South Africa. I mean, the archaeological is similar. For the French people, it's exactly the same literary research. There is not any continuity. I mean, they are not the Neanderthals, they are not the Sapiens. I mean, but it's the same technology. And I mean, because we also have another technology that is here in South America, but you can think of people going down. I mean, going down. But what about the Basque technology? How do you explain those similarities?
Well, I don't have to explain it right now, but what's to say we didn't have Lavawa people over here? It depends on the date. Stuff is getting older all the time. We'll wait and see. Lavawa technology, although it is complex in its own way, it's actually relatively straightforward. I would not consider it of deep technology like the bifaces and blades that we're talking about here. I did my PhD study was on Lavawa technology, so I'm very familiar with it. I'm actually surprised we don't see it more often as being reinvented.
It's not any, it's just the recurrent value, which is very specific. It's not the other methods which are easily obtained. It's just the one that requires more preparation, more ability, more database capacity.
It does, yes, I agree.
So, I mean, I'm just speaking of the technological similarities. It's just, I mean, it would not be enough. I mean, you are mentioning other reasons, but technologically only is not.
I don't have any problem with the possibility that somebody reinvented Lavawa.
Why didn't they reinvent it?
Okay. With Lavawa, we're probably looking at 4 or 5 traits, technological traits that make Lavawa. The stuff I'm talking about is 21 different traits that are the same. Okay, that's kind of our argument. If you look, I'll tell you a little anecdote. We gave this presentation, Stephen Oppenheimer and I did in Oxford not too long ago. And a lot of different people, academics from Oxford came, and we gave this demonstration, or this presentation. And somebody said, well, how can you be sure that these things didn't just accidentally happen again? And afterwards, and we said, well, there's so many traits, the probabilities, it's not impossible, but the probabilities are so slim. And this fellow came up to us afterward and said, I'm a atomic particle physicist. And after you get past about 7 traits that are the same, it's virtually impossible statistically that they could be independent. That's what he told us. But, you know, whatever that's worth. The other question I have then is, if these things are reinvented, and any one of those traits, or maybe 2 or 3 of those traits I think could be, how did they all come together at the same time in the right place to be explained by just accident? Okay? If you're using standard archaeological comparative methods, we're always saying the Duktai, for instance, the Duktai culture in southern central Siberia turned into the Denali culture in Alaska. People use that all the time, and they use the same traits. They use traits that we're using to say this turned into that. We're doing exactly the same thing, but because there's an ocean in between, it can't be. If you put, and I've asked this question of many of my colleagues, I'm not trying to sound defensive here, but of many of my colleagues, I said, if you had, just imagine, if you had Solutrean as we see it now, but it was in Northeast Asia, would any of us question the origin of Clovis? No. It's so much alike. So the only issue is really the ocean.
Yes, and also Solutrean, I mean, they are there in a moment that is very, very large and massive, and there is just a refuge. There is not, I mean, they are not extended. You are saying they came before, they developed similar technologies.
We're not sure exactly where Solutrean came from. It's just interesting, it's the only one that's different, and it's in the Basque Refugium. If you look at the genetics, the distribution of X and X2, X originated in the Caucasus and came across northern Mediterranean and the southern Mediterranean up into the Basque Refugium. That's what the genetics says. Okay? I find that, and Stephen Oppenheimer pointed this out, and I hadn't thought of it the way he did. This is really interesting because this is during the glacial maximum. Everybody else in the northern hemisphere is going south. And these folks are going north to the glacial max, into the glacial period and into the glacial areas with women and children, because X2 is women. It's not just men hunters going out there and marrying local women. The whole population is coming up, and they're going the wrong way. What's to stop them from continuing? These are really good questions, and what we need to do with these questions is how do we test this hypothesis? Who? Okay. If we take the things that we have on the East Coast, all the artifacts and technologies that are associated with them, and put them in the Basque Country and say they're 17,000 years ago, the archaeologists over there would say pure Solutrean. Pure Solutrean. Every artifact that we have on the East Coast and these sites is represented in the Solutrean and every technology. But none, not a single one of those traits is in Eastern Siberia. Not one. But anyhow, we need to keep asking these questions, so that's fine. Any other questions? I'll try not to jump on you. Yeah. Let everybody have the...
La pregunta sería, ¿cuáles serían las semejanzas y las diferencias entre las juntas Clovis y la junta solutrense del norte de España con respecto al sector basal? Porque la base es cóncava, pero el sector basal completo, ¿cuál es el vínculo?
What would be the whole basal section? What would be the relationship between
There's many indented base points around the world. The Solutrean ones have an indented base. They're just flaked. We don't see any evidence of fluting. Although there's a couple points that look like maybe, but they're not. But they're quite small. Clovis generally are fairly large. To me, what Clovis looks like is a combination of the small indented base points and the laurel leaves combined into one tool. And that happened in the Americas because our pre-Clovis things are like the laurel leaves. So when fluting developed, so you take a laurel leaf and you flute the base, you end up with a Clovis point. Más o menos.
What would be the similitude, the
similarity
between a pre-Clovis
and the Solutrean?
They're the same.
The same, exactly the same.
Well, from our analysis, they are. Yeah, technologically and typologically, same thing. One thing that we do find quite different is that Solutrean laurel leaves show very little evidence of use as knives. Or actually, very little use of anything. So many of the laurel leaves in Solutrean don't look like they were used. But more studies need to be done. Remember, most of these collections are from 1890s, 1900. We've done some excavations since then. We only have 4 Solutrean sites that are open air. All the other Solutrean sites are in shelters. And we have none on the old beach because we don't have the old beach. So actually, the weak link in all of this is our knowledge of Solutrean is actually quite weak. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, challenges, whatever? I'm ready to have something to drink. Nothing else? Okay. Remember, don't believe what I say. Look at the evidence. Develop your own evidence. Challenge what I say. In that book, we made the assertion that the blade technologies were the same just from observation without good analysis. I had a PhD student that wanted a project, and I said, fine, challenge our assertion. So he challenged us and said his hypothesis was they weren't the same, which is what you should do. And then I got him access to all the collection, or many of the collections in Europe and in Clovis and pre-Clovis, and said, fine, you go do your analysis anywhere you want, figure it out. Luckily for us, he came back and said, you were absolutely right. They're uniquely identical. In fact, he found no other technologies in any of the Upper Paleolithic assemblages that were the same. And if they were going to happen just randomly, you'd think blade technology, blades are blades, right? No, they're very complex. And interestingly, the people in my workshop heard all this, and I showed them, the perception of the stone is completely different when they're making their blades in Solutrean than it was from Gravettian or Magdalenian that came before and after in the same place. They're really coming, I think, out of a Lavawa tradition. They're really coming out of Middle Paleolithic, probably developed someplace in European steppe, Strelitskayan or one of those groups. That's where I think they probably developed out of and then managed to get over to the refugium somehow. All right. Anything else? Anybody else? I promise not to yell at you. I get excited, but I won't yell.
Did you mention that there is a site where you're doing a sediment study of DNA in the sediments?
I did mention that, but I can't say any more. I will tell you it's in Latin America. And right now there's an article in review in Nature. Not by me, but by my PhD student. And so I can't really say any more about it, but it's going to shake the world. It's nothing to do with us because it's older. But I think it'll take the pressure off. The critics are going to go after him now instead of me. Oh. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's very kind. Okay, that's it.